time for talk. Each evening at this time, Monday through Friday, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Tonight, Rosemary takes us by means of portable camera out of our studios and maybe into your neighborhood. And now, it's time for talk.
Do you ever worry about earthquakes? Well, I don't mean a big super worry when you lie awake at night tossing and turning, but does it bother you when you consider the disaster potential of this Boot Heel area? And do you ever say, what if? What if we were to have another tremendous earthquake? What would I do? Well, a lot of people in this area have worried about that. In fact, I saved the front page of the Daily Dunklin Democrat when Pete James had an illustration of the earthquake, and the devastation would be severe in southeast Missouri, and all of the things that you would need to consider as to what to do. And of course, Pete James was not alone in the Daily Dunklin Democrat. Out of Time magazine, quaking in the Midwest not long ago, and you may remember this article. Do you see the Boot Heel on this map? Do you see Missouri? And do you see that this bar here represents the center of the fault line? And do you know where you are as you sit here watching this program on television? You're right smack in the center of that bar, which is the active fault line. And that a repeat of the 1811-1812 earthquake, which then was the worst natural disaster in recorded history. It's a disaster whose magnitude would only be eclipsed by an all-out nuclear war. The second area you see farther away from us is a mammoth shock area, which would level cities, topple buildings, and you see that takes in Memphis. It goes almost to St. Louis. It would level Dyersburg and the cities in that area. The third area of devastation would take down buildings and would, break dams, cause dams to rupture, and think of the possibilities for death. And of course, the last area would be the ground would shake and plaster would fall and windows would break, and that's as far take in Kansas and Oklahoma and the Carolinas. Geologists say this fault was created 500 million years ago. Now you can give or take a few million, when this continent was almost ripped apart. And like a prophet of doom, they say the gun is being loaded again with underground pressure, and so you can expect an earthquake at any time. Now, that may make you feel good or it may make you feel bad. And I don't have any crystal ball, and I don't know a thing about when an earthquake is going to happen. But even now, not more than 50 miles from where you're watching this, there are minor rumblings below the Earth's surface, and they're being recorded. This is a seismograph, and we can register earth tremors on what's called a Richter scale. But as we take a backward glance into our history in this bicentennial year, before seismographs and Richter scales were ever invented, we want to consider the fact that the most severe jolt to ever hit the North American continent happened in 1811 and 1812. You and I call it the New Madrid earthquake. But how did it change things? What was it like? Let me tell you that there are greatly conflicting stories. We go for our references, of course, and for what we know about the New Madrid earthquake to many of the books, History of Dunklin County, to the history of Missouri by Houck and also by Douglas. But we drew heavily on some books that are at the Dunklin County Library. Reelfoot and the New Madrid Quake was one. Just Earthquake by Navarra was another. The one we found most valuable as we studied about the New Madrid earthquake is a book by Kennett, the quakes of 1811 and 1812, and this is the most valuable and most interesting book. However, you use all of these books together when you get an account of the earthquake. Facts are that there are legends concerning earthquake that the Indians have brought down. The Spanish wrote, a Spanish historian in 1699 wrote about a tremendous quake, but nobody lived here to record anything about it, so we know very little about that. Everyone who writes seems to have his own personal theory, and you take your pick. And no matter what you decide, you'll have difficulty in deciding between the action of the river and the earthquake, which was the most tremendous force in shaping this region. Of course, many of you are aware that most people believe the delta of the Mississippi was right here in this, the Gulf of Mexico was right here in this area at one time, and has maybe even the action of the earthquake had split this continent, and that was the creation of the Mississippi River. Let me read you what, in a history of Dunklin County, Missouri, 1845 to 1895, let me read you just a tiny bit of what this historian says about the action of the earthquake here. Dunklin County's swamps and sloughs were undoubtedly made then, also its prairies and sand blows. Many of the fissures in the earth are yet plainly visible in this area, especially on Horse Island. Now, Horse Island is Zenith, and the foothills west of Malden. That's one idea about what this land was like and what the earthquakes did. But Amos Stoddard is another historian who wrote in the 1800s before the earthquake, and let me tell you what he says about the country. He spoke of the great swamp that began just 3 miles south of Cape Girardeau and extended south. And he calls it a gloomy region covered with water annually, and at all seasons a heavy growth of timber and cane brakes. Half of the land between the St. Francis and the Mississippi River are covered with swamps filled with cypress, and they're mostly dry in the summer, though unless they be drained at great expense or banks constructed to keep water from them, they will never be of any service to agriculturalists. Many creeks and bayous rise in them and flow into both rivers, as many as one of them every 15 miles. Stoddard talked about extensive prairie areas also, but before the disaster of 1811 and 1812, the country had well earned its reputation as a sunk country. And here you see many cypress as evidenced by what Amos Stoddard saw when he wrote those words. Now, concerning the earthquake of 1811 and 1812, the Indians and, of course, the peoples who lived there were very superstitious. There were lots of myths and legends that have arisen about this, and one of the major contributing factors to that was a tremendous, brilliant comet that appeared. Now, comets have had their part in written history all through the years, and you see here on the cover of this book on comets a little representation of what peoples through the years have thought about comets and how they have portrayed them in their history. But let me read you about what happened in 1811 and 1812. Here's the picture of a comet that has really been touched up. But Tolstoy in his War and Peace made reference to the brilliant comet of 1811. He says it's a white light and long uplifted tail, and it portends all kinds of woes to the world. And this comet was a splendid object in the late fall sky of 1811 and could still be seen with the naked eye of 1812. So you see why anyone would think when that comet hung in there that here was an omen of evil and death, because the earthquake struck in December of 1811. And some of the accounts of that earthquake are most interesting. Those who were on the Mississippi River at the time of the shocks wrote of a great turbulence of water and an upward thrust of the riverbed that was created, and by that was created a retrograde current, which means it flowed backwards. The water was tepid above blood heat, despite the chill temperature of the air. Another account said other areas of the river and call it to be cut in twain while the rivers poured down a vast chasm into the bowels of the earth. There were roaring falls and rapids on the Mississippi. They disappeared in 2 days, and the sand was tremendous. A portion of the St. Francis was blown higher than the banks, and white sand poured out like water. There were geysers of sand everywhere. Of course, the town of New Madrid was inundated. Log houses could give, and they did for the first few quakes, but by the February the 7th, everything was in shambles. The earth rolled in waves and swells several feet in height, and as these swells would burst, water and sand and charcoal and all sorts of organic matter would be thrown out at tremendous force, and all with a sulfurous odor of brimstone. Of course, the shock was so tremendous, it threw people out of bed. As we said, it rang church bells as far away as Boston. The old gentleman who wrote that we were thrown out of bed says it like this. He said it was 2 in the morning, of course, and the whole family is thrown out of bed, and he says, I thought, this is the day of the Lord. And then he said, I thought, it couldn't be the day of the Lord. It's black as pitch outside. It's dark. It's 2 in the morning. Imagine that thought going through your mind. But let me tell you that the subject of religion really was interesting to people to whom it had never been interesting before, and there arose what were called earthquake Christians. The greater the shocks and the harder the tremors, the more people were interested in religion. And then as those tremors would subside, so would they subside in their membership at church. And so the term earthquake Christian came into being. There was curious animal behavior at this time. One gentleman writes of animals that all ran together. There were wolves and panthers and squirrels and fox and possums and raccoons all running together with seemingly no fear of man, all just afraid of what was taking place in the earth's tremor. John James Audubon, who was a great naturalist and wrote exacting accounts, was in Kentucky. He talked about the behavior of his horse as it would stand still with its legs spread. And he said the horse would just emit low moans. He thought the rumble was of an approaching storm, and he was trying to urge the horse to go, and it would not move. One other interesting thing about this New Madrid quake, there is a term that has arisen that was most interesting to me. At the same time, in Venezuela, there was a tremendous earthquake in 1811, 1812. Congress voted $50,000 in aid for the people in Venezuela. So Congress decided to help the people in the New Madrid area, and they issued what were called certificates of dislocation. That meant if you had any damaged lands, that you could take this certificate and trade it for land anywhere else in the territory. Most people had 640 acres. But interestingly enough, speculators from St. Louis learned about this transaction before the settlers in New Madrid themselves did. So they rushed down and bought this 640 acres for something like $35 to $40 from these settlers who were glad to get rid of this land that kept moving anyway. They took these certificates of dislocation and traded it for valuable land in St. Louis and Chicago. One man even tried to buy the hot springs of Arkansas. They didn't let him have it. The settlers in every case were defrauded, but here's what some of the settlers also did. They sold their 640 acres to this man, and to this man, and then to this man. And the historians say there was endless litigation. And so by 1820, the term New Madrid claim was synonymous with fraud, just like Confederate money was synonymous for money that was no good. The New Madrid earthquake holds many interesting things as we take a backward look into our history in this bicentennial year.
You have been watching Time for Talk. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Each evening, Monday through Friday at this time, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. If you are aware of items of interest, please let us know for possible airing on this program.